He was a tough guy, this coworker of mine. He had served in the special forces in the jungles of Central and South America, chasing drug smugglers. And he liked to pick on us. We had a good office banter amongst the group of us, teasing each other most every day. He usually picked on us for being out of shape and overweight, which he was not. The best we could come up with him was his hair was thinning a little bit and he was shorter than all the rest of us. But then one day we were golfing and he had on a tank top and on his shoulder was this huge tattoo. And with all of his tough talk, we thought it would be like a lion or a bear or something kind of scary. But it wasn't. It was a big flower. And so we hassled him a bit about the flower. The next day he brought in a picture of his shoulder from after a wound had healed. They'd had a firefight in the jungle. Mortar had gone off near him, gone through the pack that he was carrying, and the communications gear in that pack had stuck into his shoulder, and battery acid got into that wound. And the wound looked really gnarly, and then we understood why the tattoo was there, to cover up that wound that he had. Now that was a pretty good story. All of us as human beings get physical wounds that scar. Some of them are little, some of them are big and gnarly, some of them have good stories. Some of them are stories that we would be just soon not tell because they're embarrassing. Others of them are stories we're proud of. And sometimes they're stories we just don't want to tell. I had another coworker who, as a child, had in the kitchen of their house, they had a stand-on-the-floor deep fryer that had tipped over, and he had gotten severe burns all over his body. Now, as I knew him, he was like 6'2", and those burns, as you grow, right, they look different, and so he had some scars on his neck and his arms, his physical scars, the wounds had all healed. But he told me that his parents still couldn't talk about it. They still could not talk about the day that he got those burns because that wound for them, that emotional, psychological, parental wound was still fresh. So sometimes our wounds heal, sometimes we carry them for a long time. There's stories we don't want to tell, stories we might tell. By my count, Judas, the guy that betrayed Jesus, is named in the New Testament 22 times. 3 of them are simple, like there was Judas, one of the disciple kind of things. But one of those takes place in a story about him betraying Jesus. 4 of them are instances in each of the Gospels that are talking about Judas bringing the mob to arrest Jesus, which leaves 15. The rest of the 15 are not necessarily in the story of the betrayal. They're just stories from the New Testament. But anytime Judas is referenced, there's always like commas. So Judas, comma, the one who betrayed Jesus, comma. All 15 of them. Then it's not always said just that way. This morning we hear from Peter who says the one who guided them to arrest Jesus. So what that tells us is out of 22 mentions, only 2 of them are just kind of, there was a guy Judas. All of the rest of them get attached to betrayal. So in the early church, and this is even years after it happened, they could not talk about Judas without saying, you know, the guy that betrayed Jesus. Which tells you that they still carried some pain of their own sense of betrayal from what it was that Judas did. Now, the other thing about this is almost all of these namings of Judas happen in the Gospels. The one we heard today is from Acts, at the very beginning of Acts. After that, not a word. It does not get named again in any of the letters, the whole rest of the book of Acts. It's as if the wound was so fresh and the story was so painful that they just didn't want to talk about it at all. And that happens, right? We get to those places where our wounds and aren't yet scars, and we're in that place of not wanting to share those painful things, and we don't want to dwell in that space. You can even hear it as Peter gets up to talk about, they have to elect another apostle, right? Because they need 12, like the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's a wholeness in that. And he can't get up and do that without saying why they need a 12, right? And so he gets up, and they kind of have a congregational meeting. They don't really use a constitution or Robert's Rules of Order, though. They just drew straws based on who had seen what everything Jesus had done. But when Peter introduces it, he can't ignore what Judas did, but you hear him already starting to want to soften it. So he says, you know, Judas, the guy that guided the ones that arrested him, and just as Scripture said it was going to happen, right? He's pointing and kind of blaming it on God. This had to happen for Scripture. And even Jesus in the Gospel of John, the days praying, he's saying goodbye to the disciples, and as he works his way through that, he says, Lord, you know, all mine are yours are mine, protect them. The world's going to hate them, already does. Keep them safe from evil, sanctify them, just as I'm sanctifying myself. And all that prayer, you hear him say that he lost one. So protect them all but the one that was destined to be lost to fulfill Scripture. Now, I read these stories last week with our middle and high school kids in Sunday school, and one of them, their observation was, well, that seems terrible that somebody would have to do that and die the way you died just to fulfill Scripture. And I thought that was fair, right? Like, yeah, just because it says that, does that mean it has to happen? But that for me raised some pretty deep questions, really. One being, does God really need to destine some people to do terrible things? Does Scripture have to be fulfilled in those ways? And the more I thought about it, I don't want to believe in a God that would work that way, on the one hand. But on the other hand, I was mindful of what happens when I teach confirmation. I will regularly invite the kids into an activity that they have no idea has anything to do with a Bible story. Like I'll ask them to build a city or do something like that. And as they do it, they almost every time act out just the way the Bible story acted out, in its brokenness and in its blessing, right? And so I wonder if the destined wasn't so much that Judas was destined himself to do this, so much as it doesn't matter when Jesus shows up, we're going to betray him, and it's going to happen that somebody's going to do it, and it just happened to be that Judas was the one that chose to do that along the way, right? So the first question is, does God destine some of us to do that? And I hope not. The second question, sometimes we ask, why do bad things happen to good people? In this case, I think we can ask, why do seemingly good people do terrible things? And then, does God need us to do that so that somehow God can do God's work and bring life into the world? Because when you read through all of Scripture, you see a lot of grace and a lot of promises of life. And does God need us to do terrible things so that God can do that? And I sure hope not. It seems to me that we have free will and we choose to do plenty of terrible things all on our own. And then God shows up in the aftermath of that to bring new life, right? So the third question then is, what is the story of Judas, or even thinking about the early churches not wanting to keep telling it? Does it matter to us today that that story is there? And if you think about this, we do tell the story of Judas. We tell it on Good Friday, maybe in Passion Week a little bit. So we've narrowed it down to 1 week of the year where we can talk about Judas. We get a little bit of a mention today, but most of the year we don't really tell that story. Just like the early church stopped telling that story, right? They would talk about it when they had to, but mostly they just prefer not to. So we can look at the story and say, well, 2,000 years ago, the one guy that had to do what had to be done so Jesus could get to the cross, right? But again, I don't think that's how the mechanics worked. Jesus went to the cross because people are people, and if he shows up again today preaching love and grace the way he did, we put him on the cross too, right? So all of that then says, is this just an old story where the one guy did what he had to do, and we all live post-Easter, so we're resurrection people. We don't need that story anymore. But then I started to think about the story of Judas. Peter says he shared the ministry among us. He had his share in that ministry. So his betrayal of Jesus is also a betrayal of those people that loved him, trusted him, cared about him, and shared community with him. Does that ever happen in our world today, where people that are loved, trusted, and shared community with betray other people? Happens all the time, right? Today, I would suspect somewhere a spouse is going to find the evidence of the affair that they suspected was happening. Today, somewhere, a woman who's part of a working community that she thought was safe is going to get abused and have that trust betrayed in a way that she hoped would never happen to her. Today, I think probably somewhere there's somebody sitting down trying to find tax loopholes and other financial law things that they can do so that they can make more money, which will one day lead to the next Enron or the next financial collapse that costs people their homes and their retirement. And that's a betrayal of a community in a whole other way. So we live with this around us all the time. So the story of Judas is not just a story of what one guy did bad a long time ago. It's really an invitation for us to look at some of the darker stuff that we maybe don't want to talk about and would just as soon be kept under wraps. This is hard to talk about, right? Because those very things that we don't want to talk about are painful sometimes, and sometimes the wounds are still there. My coworker that had the tattoo, right? It was covering up something that had already become a scar. The other one, had the scars, but his parents couldn't tell the story because they still had the wounds. And wounds are all different, really. None of us can tell any of the rest of us how to grieve or how to heal or how to forgive, because it all goes kind of unfolds in its own way. But as it goes, it happens in different ways. My grandma almost lost her hand about a decade ago when she had this huge infection And the only way they could get it to heal was to open it up and leave it open. Like normally you think you have surgery and then they close you all up, but not in this case. They had to leave it open and like rinse it, just keep working at it so it could start healing with fresh air and water and all the rest of that. But that's not how all wounds get healed, right? Sometimes you got to sew them up and wrap them up and then re-wrap them up and wrap them up again. Sometimes wounds really, you think they're healed and then they break back open, right? Like wounds are painful and they can hang around and linger, and healing comes in all kinds of different ways. But what the story of Judas does is invite us into trying to think maybe about what it looks like to forgive, what it looks like to be forgiven, and what happens when we maybe leave those wounds wrapped up for too long and they don't have an opportunity to heal. And again, right, none of us get to tell anybody else how this works. But I have a colleague who, just before Easter, was talking to a woman, and she shared with him, again, he had heard this story before, but it was her story of abuse. And as she shared that story of abuse, it had been 70 years that she had been carrying this with her. Now you might think as she talked about how that wound was still open that she would talk about that betrayal and the brokenness of all of it, but that wasn't what she was talking to him about. She was talking to him about the darkness that was in her heart, that she still couldn't forgive that person. And because of the darkness that she carried in her heart, she thought that God probably couldn't forgive her. Now that's pretty messed up, right? She got abused, and here now she's trying to figure out if God can forgive her because of her getting abused. Right? And so that's why this story of Judas to me is important, is that it can open us back up to those places where we get messed up and how healing and blame and guilt and shame and all that just sits on us as human beings. So he looked at her and said, listen, you've already been forgiven, right? You've been carrying this around and trying to figure out if God can. God already did. Because when Jesus went to the cross, he met Judas there. And each and every one of us in our own ways that we bring breaches of trust and betrayal to other people, that forgiveness is already ours. Every time we gather around this fountain at this table, we talk about how Jesus has already given us forgiveness. Now that doesn't mean it's easy for us to carry. It doesn't mean that we immediately absorb that and go, oh right, I forgot, and then today is a different kind of day. But it is an invitation into a journey that may not always be easy to uncover those wounds and work them toward being scars. As we talk about this, I'm also mindful of that woman, right? So she's wondering if Jesus could forgive her for not forgiving. I wonder if Peter thought that. Like if later they were sitting around with the new number 12 and saying, I just got a lot of darks in my heart. I don't know if I can forgive Judas. I wonder if Jesus, the mother of Mary, was easy to get to forgiveness of Judas for what he had done. Clearly, the fact that he disappears from the story tells us that he didn't really get talked about that much, so I think they probably all struggled with it. And one of them, Judas probably had a mom. I thought about that this week when I was reflecting on some of the moms that I have sat with as their children have done terrible things and have gone off the rails, and they've landed in places where all they want is for their child to be made whole. And they know their child has hurt people, and they are deeply sorry about that, and they wish they could make that better, but there's nothing they can do. And they land in that place of just longing for forgiveness. And this is where the gospel text ends today. Jesus says, all mine are yours and yours are mine. And he says, sanctify them. Sanctifying is kind of the process of God making us whole and holy and set apart as people. And Jesus' prayer is for that all of us, all mine are yours, all yours are mine, right? All of us can be taken to that place where wholeness is brought to us. Not because we've gotten there ourselves. We can't heal ourselves. We can't do any of that. But that Jesus shows up in those places of our own struggle, whether it's our own need to forgive or our own forgiveness that we need, right? Jesus lands in that place and just always just working to make us whole and to sanctify us so that all of us can be gathered together, trusting in that wholeness and that grace, knowing that God loves us so that we can share that love with other people. Because Jesus also reminds us that just as he was sent, we are sent. We are sent to be those agents of grace that hopefully can bandage up wounds and get to the point of scars and tell those stories of grace that have gotten us onto those scars in the journey along the way.